The climate change is a global challenge, and I mean, it doesn't matter where we go in the world. Every single person, every single country is facing clear evidence of which is impossible to ignore. And furthermore, the development and the impact are much faster than anyone could hope. And it doesn't matter if you look back 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. The development is much faster. And no responsible person, responsible government, or responsible corporation do doubt this today. It's a pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of my company, TM Insurance, to this breakout session, which we call the Melting Arctic and the Reinsurance and the Insurance Industry. My name is Hjálmar Sigurþórsson, and I will be the moderator of this session today. In my mind, the melting Arctic is the most dramatic scene we can think of in this context. And just in this country, we are seeing glaciers disappearing one after another. And we are following the ice of Greenland from a distance melting. All of this will have great impact on the weather and the weather-related hazards. To connect this to the reinsurance and the insurance industry and to discuss this, we have today with us people with deep knowledge on the subject. We have our speaker today, Dance Zurovac-Jevtic. Dance is a senior atmosphere underwriter, technical underwriter at Sirius International Insurance Corporation in Stockholm. She works with risk and pricing of catastrophe insurance contracts, covering property portfolios of large insurance companies. At Sirius, she works primarily with atmosphere catastrophes in the US, India, and China. Dance has PhD in dynamic meteorology from Stockholm University, and she has 5 years of postdoctoral experience from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and SIO, University of California, San Diego. During her academic career, she worked with development of numerical weather prediction and climate models. So I think it's difficult to find a person who has a better background to put these things into context than this. It's a really amazing background. I would especially like to express our thanks to Dance for her work to prepare this session and travel from Sweden to make this possible, and also express our thanks to Sirius International Insurance Corporation for their great support to make this possible today. And to deepen the discussion after the presentation, we are really pleased to introduce the other panelists, Hulda Ragnheiður Árnadóttir, who is the CEO of the Natural Catastrophe Insurance of Iceland. But the NCI has been for decades a fundamental resilience vehicle in this country. And Halldór Þorgeirsson, who is the chair of the Iceland Climate Council. Halldór was for many years, more than a decade, or until 2018, Director for Implementation Strategy at the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, and played in this capacity an important role in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement. So, Dance, please welcome. The floor is yours. And we will then afterwards, after her presentation, then we will start the panel discussion and open for questions.
So thank you, Hjálmar, for this introduction. Thank you, TM, for organizing this session. And good morning, everyone. It's good to be here, and it's good to talk about climate change, which is indeed a hot topic. Before we continue, or actually start talking about climate change, I just use the opportunity to say a few words about Sirius International. We are the largest reinsurance company in Scandinavia. We are a global reinsurer. We have We have businesses in over 140 countries and offices in different places of the world. 50% of our income comes from our property portfolio, and therefore we are very focused on an understanding of natural catastrophes. According to a study by Munich Re, since 1980, insurance sector has paid out more than $1,400 billion for natural catastrophes, and more than 90% of this has been paid due to weather extreme events. The cost of natural catastrophes increases constantly. If you look at the 10-year moving average, the yellow line of the insured losses, and the red line shows the uninsured losses, you will see a constant trend towards ever increasing losses. Until now, the major drivers for these losses have been identified as socioeconomic effects, such as urbanization, concentrations of assets in risk-prone areas, coastal areas, and also higher living standards from one year to another. The question is, however, will this be the whole story in the future as well? We have a lot of information about losses, and for example, in 2018, which was an uneventful year for natural catastrophes, the losses amounted to $76 billion, global losses amounted to $76 billion. But what is more interesting is that more than 60% of these were not caused by primary perils, such as US hurricanes, European windstorms, or earthquakes, but due to secondary effects, which normally are not seen as the drivers of capital for most of the companies. Together with 2017, the losses for this two-year period were about, on global scale, were about $219 billion, and this is the largest ever two-year period loss recorded. But even here, more than 50% of losses came from the secondary events. Therefore, it is a valid question to ask whether we should pay more attention even to secondary events, and whether this is a signal in insurance losses that we are starting to see the long-term effects of climate change. So, before we continue to look into the real impact to insurance industry, let's review the basis of climate change that is relevant. The temperature on the Earth is regulated by the amount of energy that comes from sun and what is radiated back to space. How much is expelled is a function of the amount of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, it's a heat-trapping gas, and the amounts of carbon dioxide have been increasing, and they're increasing faster and faster. This is due to burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, but due to other things as well. What we're showing in the lower panel is are the levels of carbon dioxide in the last 4 glacial cycles. So in the last 400,000 years, the levels of carbon dioxide have varied in between 180 and 300 ppms. And the level that we have today, which is 412 ppm, is the level that has not been seen in the history of Earth for more than 1 million years. Together with carbon dioxide increase, the temperature on the Earth has been increasing as well. And here you can see that global land ocean temperature has increased by 0.8 degrees since 1880. But the temperature on Earth doesn't increase evenly around the globe. The temperature in the Arctic is increasing twice as fast as the rest of Europe. And this so-called Arctic amplification is seen as the primary signal of global warming. with the increase in temperature, we can see the decrease in the cover of the ice over Arctic, and the Arctic sea ice minimum has been decreasing constantly. Here you see in the lower panel the last 40 years, so we can calculate that for every decade the rate of change has been a decrease of about 12.8% in the Arctic sea ice. So let's see, what does it mean for to have this difference in the heating, which we can see. So here I show two panels. It's an oversimplified but conceptual picture of dynamics of the atmosphere. And in the dynamics of the atmosphere, it's the one major component of our climate, and the other is the thermodynamics of the atmosphere. So let's look first at this one. This one, the upper panel, shows what the climate, mean state of the climate was in the last century, in the 20th century. And you can see that, just a second here, yeah, okay, let's see. Yeah, here we show the temperature from the equator to the North Pole, and from the surface to the top of the troposphere. And you can see that when the temperature is very warm and very cold here, it's creating something that is called temperature gradient. And very large temperature gradient are actually moving around in the atmosphere. So for this, you can see that in the tropical region, we have a strong Hadley cell. In the northern region, we have the strong cold cell, which keeps the cold air within this region. And in between these two cells, we have the so-called mid-latitudes. And the mid-latitudes are the region where most of Europe, most of US is found. And in these latitudes, we have cyclones. And the cyclones are the cyclones are something that we in the insurance industry pay a lot of attention to. So what is happening now in the lower panel is shown what the situation would look like in the mean situation for the 21st century when the Arctic is warming. And when the Arctic is warming, you will see that this cold is not as cold anymore as it used to be, and therefore the so-called temperature gradient is decreasing. And if you have this effect, it means that all the cells will weaken. And in between, in mid-latitudes, the westerly winds will weaken, and there will be, on the net, we can expect that we have weaker cyclones, we have less precipitation. So this is the dynamics. Then we have to add the thermodynamics. The thermodynamics is telling us what is the importance of the fact that the atmosphere is warming. If the atmosphere is warming, something that is warmer has more energy. And so this is driving in the opposite direction. So warmer atmosphere contains more water vapor. It means that oceans are warmer, the air is warmer, there is more water vapor, and for every 1 degree increase in temperature, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more water vapor. So it means that when precipitation gets started, when the rains start forming, they have a lot more potential, and there will be, as a result, an increase in the number of the extreme precipitation, which might, of course, in certain situations lead even to more floods. It also means that for hurricanes and typhoons and other cyclones that they have very strong winds that do a lot of damage. It's also important to understand that these, once they start forming, in many situations they will continue forming faster, and therefore will have tropical cyclones and such as hurricanes and typhoons that will get stronger. But even the mid-latitude cyclones, the European winter storm, they are expected to increase in strength. So now you heard a little bit about dynamics and the thermodynamics, but the atmosphere, the physics of the atmosphere is utterly more complicated than you can imagine. So there is no way other than using the so-called climate models that we try to express the physics of the atmosphere using the mathematical understanding and building these huge softwares that we call climate models. So in these simulations, the climate model would then tell us that in a warmer world, the storms will probably not be many more than today, but the stronger ones will get even stronger, which is important for insurance industry. Let's take a look at a few examples of what we already have observed, which is connected to melting Arctic and warmer climate. Well, we have seen this in the few years, in the last few years. We have had years when the winters have been even colder. So some people have been asking, how is the climate warming if the winters are getting colder in the US? And we have intense snowstorms, both in the US and in Europe. And so analyzing the atmosphere, scientists figured out that in certain years, when the autumn is warmer, then the westerly winds are not as strong, and the heat is transforming more easily towards the poles. This means that the ice is not building in the same way as it normally does, so the ice cover gets smaller. There is more heat around over the North Pole. In certain years, this heat finds its way up into upper levels in the stratosphere. And the stratosphere, you can see that the normal, all right, well, get too many of these. Okay, so here I want to show this. So this is the normal circulation in the stratosphere. You see this, this dark blue vortex. It's sort of swirling around, keeping the cold air over the North Pole. However, when this heat finds its way up to the stratosphere, it will it might disrupt the circulation, and it will split the vortex into two. This allows very cold air to go down to more southern latitudes, and in mid-latitudes we get more intense snowstorms in the US and Europe, for example, with lots of snow. Other things that we notice, of course, is the behavior of hurricanes. In the insurance industry, we're very focused on the losses that especially US hurricanes produce. And in 2017, we had Hurricane Harvey. In 2018, we had Hurricane Florence. And basically, the Hurricane Harvey almost stalled when it got over land. And it dumped this much water, 1.3 meters water, during a very short time in certain locations. So the question may be, is this because of climate change? Well, this question is impossible to answer. But what we can do is, like a study that have recently been shown, is we can use climate models and use the climate of the last century and run model simulations that show, for example, that annual probability, in this case, annual probability of 500 millimeters, that's a half meter, anywhere in Texas in the last century was 1%. It means that this can happen once in 100 years. When we run the models with the future climate, we show that, I mean, the study shows, of course, that there will be an 18% probability that this will happen. It's 1 in 5.5 years. So now you see what a tremendous difference the state of the atmosphere will make. And if we just assume that the frequency is linear, we can calculate that it is 6% probability, which means once in 16 years in 2017. These kind of studies are called attributional studies. They are becoming more evolved. Weather agencies such as German Weather Service have announced that they will start showing these kind of studies after extreme events to raise people's awareness of the effects of global change. It is also very convenient for the insurance industry, and if I have time, I will walk you through how that will affect pricing in the insurance industry based on the fact that we have to know the current state. We cannot look only back 100 years and do the pricing based on the history. Let's look at some more here. Sea level rising, yeah, this is obvious. I mean, if the sea level, or it will rise because it rises because the water gets warmer, you have thermal expansion, and it rises, of course, because the glaciers are melting, and this is the water that goes into the oceans. So there are obviously plenty of places, as you can see, around the world that might get in real trouble. See here, this is Florida, 1 meter difference. Here you have megacities that will certainly have to take this into serious account, how to handle. Wildfires. Wildfires are connected to droughts. We have more extreme droughts in California than we've had in many decades. And you can see here, in the last decade, these are the losses. Obviously, wildfires are something that will become more frequent, and which we'll have to take into account even in the, of course, in the insurance. And then the fact that, for example, these wildfires are considered as secondary events. So they are not considered as something that is very important. But if you are in California and you experience a loss of $12 billion, then certainly you should continue asking, is this really a secondary effect, or should we take this into account? In global insurance, this is an important question. Very quickly, I don't have time to talk about it. Climate models are representation of nature. Nature is chaotic. Nature is nonlinear. We will never, with the level of knowledge that we have in mathematics and physics, will never be certain. There will always be an interval of uncertainty. But what we can do is to look at the results. Sorry, guys. And you can see climate model simulations say that heat waves are something that they're very, very certain. And you have a scale here. Of course, it's less certain how many or how strong the hurricanes would be, because it's much more difficult to model. All right, let's have a few words of something that I find the most important actually topic right here. And this is, what are the implications for insurance? What do we know so far for insurers and their partners, meaning us reinsurers? The fact is actually that climate risks can be divided into physical, liability, and transitional risks. Physical risks are those that are connected with the change in frequency, change in severity, and these are the risks that we should pay most attention to. So what kind of problems will we end up? Well, there will be a real problem in certain situations. Some risks might become uninsurable, and this is because insurability will be connected to the pricing of the risk. And if we are not certain how to price the risk, and we do not pay attention to pricing in advance, we might end up having a strong event with lots of losses and high losses, and then the reinsurers don't have any means but to try to adjust their pricing at that moment. And at that moment, we add an additional margin, which is going to be too high, which is going to render the risk unaffordable. So the reinsurers can either end up in this situation, or withdraw the capacity and say, I don't want to do this. This area is not what I want to do anymore. I will move out. So this has happened before. Recently, 2002 German floods. The insurance industry and everybody has to accept a raise of 50%. This was because they were not aware of the fact that this was a real risk. In Hurricane Katrina 2005, some capital disappeared. People just decided, we can't do this. This is too dangerous for us. So in order not to be in that situation, we have to take action before it happens. And this is what I will try to tell in the few new slides, the additional slides. Important thing is to have the so-called gradual adaptations of products. You have to make sure you know your exposure, you know your risks, and you know how they're related to climate change. If you know that, then the next question is, what should we do? Property and casualty, which is my specialty, I can tell you what I would advise people to do if they really want to prepare for this. The first step is to stay focused on really big catastrophe. Catastrophe events cover 85% on nat cat losses, which are weather related, and they're very important. They will become stronger. If you do business with hurricanes, with typhoons, pay attention to that. The losses will get stronger. Extreme events are likely to increase due to climate change. But that's not all, and this is very important to realize that one of the most significant effects of warmer world is likely to be an increased frequency of moderate to severe events, and these may erode profitability of your profitability if not adequately reflected in pricing. There is actually a recent study by Swiss Re, and they have the best data on historical data of losses, and they claim that it's a new situation emerging where they can see that the frequency and severity and the cost of localized events is actually driving a lot more than people used to think. So in that context, these independent secondary perils, and here I write out which perils these are, like river floods, flash floods, thunderstorms, winter storms in the US, droughts and wildfires. These are all so-called secondary events. And then we have secondary effects of primary effects, such as hurricane-induced precipitation, storm surges, tsunamis. These are the effects that we have to pay real attention to because they will be changed in the new climate. And then I don't have time to talk about the transitional risk or liability risks. I can only say that attributional studies could be seen as something that even regulators would pay more attention to in the future. A few words of excellent. A few more words of advice for if there's are there any actuaries here? Actuaries are people who price, and so this is a very interesting area because all the insurance is based on the prices and the balance, and we all pay something for our house not to burn down, and in case it burns down, so we can be insured, and somebody is deciding what is the real price for this. So these are the people that really should pay attention to climate change, and what I'm saying is that when actuaries develop probabilistic models, they always start out from the historical data. They take the historical data and use statistical models to extend the data. But the long data sets are no help if the data is subject to trends. If the trends are not recognized, the data will give you a false picture of certainty, and you will end up having models that are more representative of a state around here. If we say this is present state, this is past, this is future, if you only take into account historical data, you remember when I was talking about Texas and flooding, the event was 1 in 100 years if you look back in time. And if you ignore that there are trends that will affect your losses in the future, you will not be able to figure out that actually in future this event will become a lot more frequent, and this is why we have to pay attention to this to make it sure that people understand that these will be effects of the climate change, and this is how it affects our data. So, is there anybody who's heard about the catastrophe models? There's a huge industry for global insurers and reinsurers who use these very complicated catastrophe models, especially for like huge perils like US hurricanes and windstorms. And they're very good help, but remember, they are also built based on the historical data. So this is the new thing. try to sort of, if you bring with you anything from this talk, try to remember that it is important to re-emphasize the climate change effects quantitatively, not only qualitatively, because just talking about quality raise awareness, but when you start talking about numbers, then people start to have a different approach to it, at least in the insurance industry. Anyway, there are changes on the way in May. UK Financial Authority, PRA, they introduced stress testing for climate change for UK insurers that are done biannually. This is very new, and I think that's the step in the right direction, because what you do is, what you normally would want to do is to stress your portfolio to see what different scenarios, if the climate changes, you know, in the range of these different scenarios, how will that affect your portfolio? What will it do to your business? All right, so I want to end with this. I didn't have time to talk about uncertainty. Here is a figure from IPCC showing we have large uncertainties, but there are things that we are really aware of, and I have tried to pick those that we really are certain about and to talk about them. But of course, actively monitoring, that's the key. And that's the key that will, of course, make insurance industry adapt to the new climate as well. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Really interesting. I would say for myself it was quite technical, but still in a very good context. So thank you very much. Questions?
Okay. Thank you for this presentation, and hello to the panel. Just to explain who I am, some of you know me, but I used to work for the insurance sector in Iceland for 14 years. I'm now a professor at the University of Iceland, so I know the sector quite well. And the others, I have question one in terms of like bringing this to a practical level. One side of the coin is the forecast and adjust the pricing models and raising the price. That is maybe one side. But the other side is how are we going to deal with emissions? And what is the role of the insurance sector in emission reductions? That is one thing. And how, and this point, if you are willing to answer this, Hjalmar, also, like in terms of the influence of actions on the clients, the corporate clients, for instance, is the insurance sector willing to do something to pressure the corporate clients, for instance? And what is the Icelandic insurance sector actually today? What are they doing? So I'm just wondering about like the role and the responsibility of the insurance sector in terms of climate mitigation, because it's not just that we want to look at the consequences, but how can we actually try to have influence in a positive way to reduce the risk?
Okay. Do you want me to start? Okay, I can start by saying that I perfectly agree with you, and I think the right way to see this is that when large events happen, the insurance industry has a very important role for the society and, of course, for all the private people to help with the recovery. Because if we have large natural catastrophes, and I'm not now talking about weather-caused events which you don't have here in Iceland, but this is a global talk. It's of course the most important at that moment to recover. The thing is that how do we recover? Well, I think the right way for the insurance industry is to make sure that when houses are rebuilt, they're rebuilt with materials that are, you can of course figure out which materials are more environmentally friendly, and the whole process of rebuilding has to be sort of focused on putting in the right direction. So we do not use old materials, we do not use old ways that are not as good for the society as the ones that exist. So that's one of the comments that I have, and I think that's one of the easiest and most, not easiest maybe, but the most obvious ways for the insurance sector to help. The other is that I didn't have enough time to tell you, but it is very, very important to remember that climate changes will affect different locations differently. And like here in Iceland, you're very much less exposed to strong weather events. If you lived in Florida, you would be a lot more concerned. So therefore, the strength of a good insurer and reinsurer is to know their own portfolio, to know exactly which locations are exposed to them. And I mean, some prices will need to go up because this is an area that will be affected. Other will not. And that's the trick. That's the secret to convince people who you work with that you know what you're doing. You're just not raising prices the way you want to. You're just doing this because this is the appropriate way to do to handle this.
I know Halldór has an opinion on this.
Yes, I think it's important to just talk straight here because we have a rather limited time. And maybe I should just clarify my background. I've worked for the climate process for quite some time, and that has included a long-standing, very deep relationship with the insurance sector. So this conversation has been going on for a long time. And just to Laura's point, let's just be honest here, we have been able to get through to the risk side of insurance. The asset side of insurance is just now waking up. Let's just say it as it is. And when they wake up, that's just like an elephant. Not an elephant, it's not a good animal. Waking. So I think it's really important to make this point because climate change and responding to climate change is not about new investment, it's about smarter investment. And we know that there's been an assessment of the infrastructure that needs to be built between now and 2030. All the infrastructure, 90 trillion per year. And there's been comparison of two scenarios in doing that. One is business as usual, and the other one is doing it Paris compatible. You know what the difference is? It's less than 10%. So smart investment that gets us to where we need to go is not that big, and this has not factored in any of the benefits of a smarter investment. So it's just the investment. So I think it's really important to make this point here. If I could just make, to connect this also to kind of what has been the response, because I really found your presentation excellent. I think it's so important to get to the depth of this. We cannot just be talking about the surface. So I think you did an excellent job of conveying really quite complex picture in a clear way. And so maybe from my side, having this policy experience, maybe I should also give you a very quick image here. And it's a bit of a sad story, but sometimes I think it's a sad story with a happy ending, so maybe rest assured. The climate negotiations have been locked down on this topic for a very long time over theory rather than practice. And this is so important difficulty in all negotiations. So what on the surface looks just actually ends up being destructive. And let me just be very clear on this. The polluter pays principle that came out of Rio in '92 has actually created a lot of difficulties in this conversation because it has been taken to the extreme of saying basically all we need is to create a liability scheme. So those that have emitted, they will pay into a fund, and that will be used to meet this, these risks. And it's completely impossible to get an agreement on something like that at an international level. So I don't want to bore you with the details, but I really just want to tell you about this very difficult conversation. What happened in Paris was that there was finally a closure on this, where there's basically, we will not go that far in We will not go to the full loss and damage type of approach to this, but we will go through cooperation and mobilizing resources. And in parallel with the negotiations, there has been a huge progress in both in conversation between the insurance industry and the United Nations and the World Bank. I don't have the time to explain that here, but also voluntary mobilization of hard cash, led mainly by Germany and others in the context of G7 and G20. And this, if you want to look at this, you can look at it through the insure resilience. It's a new word, kind of combine insurance and resilience, so you get insure resilience. It's an initiative to capitalize basically funds that could actually deal with this. And so that you don't need to bring me back in, I think I just wanted to make one more point, which I think is such an important point for this conversation. We need to create incentives here for prevention. Not just incentives, but actual hard reason for prevention. And I think the strongest key to that is to actually connect insurance coverage and the cost of those premiums to the preparations that we will make. We all know this, for example, you get a discount on your insurance if you have a fire extinguisher in your home. It's really important that those that have made the preparations and have done the precautionary efforts, they would have access to lower cost insurance. So these are my 3 points.
You sounds like an insurance person.
Well,
it's good.
Yes.
Good. Next question.
Right, well, insurers are not going to obviously place insurance unless they can get reinsurance. So, are there any markets now, say Florida, etc., where it's difficult, say for insurers, pension insurers, to get natural catastrophe insurance?
It's a very good question because it of course puts insurance in the context of global economy, and that's something that we didn't have time to touch upon. But we are of course for I think since 2008 or 9 we have entered something called soft market, which the soft market means that yeah, that's it. When we do certainly open, for example, in reinsurance, it means that there is more capital than there's always, regardless of the high losses we paid, at the moment, there's always enough capital. And as long as that is the situation, then the forces of the market doesn't work the way we used to. As in other cycles, we would have like soft and hard, and it would sort of even out, and this is an extraordinary situation. So at this point, I'm not aware, but it is a little. There are some little small signs of hardening, and we have had several typhoons in Japan with really big losses. Maybe that might affect the market somewhat, but at the moment I don't have a better answer.
Okay, thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, I have a question about the Icelandic situation, and it touches on what Halldór mentioned. I see the necessity of mobilizing mitigation and what you call climate change amendments in a way. Adaptation to you. Who would do this job in Iceland? The thing is that I look upon the insurance companies, I see the risks, but I'm still thinking, how can we mitigate, and should it be the volunteers, for example, that rely on just social volunteering to pay them for doing some sort of rescuing? Or should it be a private-public collaboration to really do these necessary the mitigations and adaptation to rescue sort of our infrastructure, for example?
If I just may pick up
how to left. I think it is important that each and every person shows responsibility, and we cannot always point on someone else. Each and everyone has to really be responsible himself for what to do the mitigation work. And I think what he said about pricing on insurance can differ on what is the mitigation work that has been done for each insurer. And this is what we have seen, for example, in California, in Switzerland, in New Zealand, that the insurance companies, they are actually paying back some money with discounts to their people. And in case, for example, in California, those are real amounts that they are giving back to the insurers, so they can do the mitigation work properly for the future risk to reduce. And I think that's something that we must start to really think about. How can each and everyone take the responsibility on his own?
I'm actually more asking in the lines of infrastructure, power plants, roads, harbors, these big investments that we all rely on.
Maybe just a very quick comment, because you asked about the Icelandic context, and I was in my reflections focusing very much on the global perspective. But in terms of Iceland, the Iceland Climate Council, that I have the honor of chairing, has launched a conversation, national conversation on risks and adaptation. And this, we've had an impact assessment, a very good impact assessment for Iceland prepared by our scientists. And we launched this with a conference this spring. And we are now working on the adaptation response for Iceland. And it's really important to know where you should begin. And there's been a lot of effort to deal with increased intensity of rainfall. We've heard about that here, and there is quite a bit of awareness already in terms of the sewage system and what that means, and there a lot of investment is going into this from the municipalities, and it's really important that that becomes an effective investment. But there's also a requirement on the government to change the references in the law around zoning and those kind of issues. And that's a very complicated thing, because you don't want to over-engineer things, because it's actually economical, and here my insurance guy comes back, it's actually more economical to plan in that there will be losses. And for Icelanders, they understand this very well, because in 1974 we made the ring road around the island, and part of the ring road goes on alluvial plains, outgrowth plains from our largest glacier, and those were designed to go, and they have done so very faithfully.
Yeah.
Next question.
My name is Hjörtur Guttormsson, and I am especially thinking about sea level rise and the influence on insurance policy. I'm looking forward to the ice cap of Greenland melting in the coming century and huge effects. How can insurance policy be a guideline and help the physical planning to go in the right direction? You can think about the place where you are sitting today, and it can be large, certainly in the future. And I think this is very, very essential globally because of the effect on the big cities and municipalities. Thank you.
This was actually one of your points. You did mention a few big cities
Yes.
around the globe.
Yes, yes. Just to put this in the right context, you know, all ice that sits already in the water doesn't change the sea level if it melts. If it already sits in the water, Pythagoras law just tells you that it's going to melt, it's going to be the same. However, what is changing is the temperature. If the temperature of the water increases, it means that there is a physical process called thermal expansion, and that is raising the land. And all the glaciers, all the ice over land, such as Greenland, if the Greenland were to melt, we would say they have done the calculations, this sea levels would rise with 7 meters. That's awful, right? So, but this is not something that is going to happen. Even if we continue business as usual, I think the simulations would say that by the end of the century, that the sea levels will rise like that now. So these are the extremes of what can happen as far as we know right now. But the fact is actually that we certainly should expect slow increase, centimeter by centimeter, year by year, there will be an increase, and therefore it's, as you say, it's everybody's concern. We have to find ways to figure out how to adapt, what to do.
That's it. One more question.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much for an informative lecture. But I was just wondering regarding the insurance, because you said that in the future probably some catastrophes won't be insurable. And for example, in Florida, there are often storms that raise all the houses. Do you think that the insurance would be able to put some strict on when they are rebuilding the houses, that they should build it in different forms, that they can break the storm better and all that? And if they don't, then they won't be insurable?
In Florida, it's regulated in a special way, because the Florida regulators, they have, it's not free market, although it's in the US is normally seen as free market, but it's not in the insurance. So therefore, it's hard to answer that more precisely. If it was a free market, you would say that, okay, well, I can just withdraw. I can say I will not write business in the area of, say, 5 kilometers from the coast, and so I only write business in. But it's not the legislator in Florida would say that you have to insure, and therefore, they have to apply for certain regulations to be changed, but it just makes sense. Many intelligent people, of course, in the US understand that. And if you want to have a cottage, build your cottage, but then you can't insure it. If it's on the beach, well, it's very cool, but you can't insure it.
Quick. Yeah, just very quick, two quick, very important points here, because we're talking about insurability, and it's really clear that just before Paris, the insurance industry spoke up, and one of the leaders said, anything beyond 2 degrees is completely insurable. So we have to understand the limits on this. I also think we have to understand the intensity of what's happening. If I could just very quickly tell you that I called a friend of mine that from Bahamas, and they had, many of them, invested in buying very hardened glass that was able to sustain everything that they would be expecting. They all went. So let's not forget that we are seeing things within next year.
Just maybe one quick question to Hulda, because Hulda is running the NCI in Iceland, which has been kind of a lifesaver for many people over the decades when we had big cat events in Iceland. How do you see the role of the NCI the way going forward? Do you think you will have to broaden the cover, or?
Actually, I was hoping that we would not get this question. I would have to explain that the biggest losses that we see are not related to climate change, which are earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And those are the losses that we pay the highest losses for.
But still you are seeing an increase in weather-related losses.
Yes, and weather-related losses are not insured by NTI, and they are insured by you.
Yes.
And it's the question.
So this is more or less that, of course, sea floods will definitely increase in the future in combination of this climate change. But in our case, I think there are more, or we should put emphasis on what is on the private insurance side, which is flash floods and the windstorm and those events that are more likely to increase than the losses that are related to the insurance that we have of NTI. So I think this should all be in cooperation between everyone here, the government, NTI, and the private insurance companies. But I think there is more need to look into the strategy of how what the private insurance companies can do, because we need people to be more aware of that they have to have those insurances in place, because otherwise they will always point at NTI when the losses occur and they do not have the insurance that they could buy on a free market. And that's something that I think is a responsibility of the government and the private insurance companies to take to work together to increase the awareness of the average people in Iceland to understand that they have to act and they have to buy the insurance that they are offered to buy, because NTI is a governmentally owned institution or company which will never overlap the business that the private insurance companies are offering. So we will never go into the business platform that you
Very good
offer.
answer. Okay, I think this is it. Anse, Hulda, Halldór, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you all for coming. And let's give them a hand.